Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new season of Maine Public Book Club. I'm your host, Bill Nemitz, and I'm thrilled that spring is in the air and we are off on another exploration of great literature and the talented authors who will share their thoughts and creativity with all of us in the coming months. This evening, we kick off with an encore visit from Amanda Peters, who joined us back in September to talk about her award-winning first novel, The Berry Pickers. Tonight, we'll be talking with Amanda from her home in Nova Scotia about her second book, Waiting for the Long Night Moon. This is a collection of short stories that take us deep into the culture, the mythology, and the hearts of Americans' Indigenous people. First, though, allow me to thank Sherman, Maine Coast Bookshops, the Park Danforth, and Coffee by Design for their generous support of the club. Without organizations like these events simply just wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to recognize our bookstore partners, where many of you secured your copy of tonight's book. Thanks to Bookstacks in Bucksport, None Such Books and More in South Portland, Mockingbird Bookshop in Bath, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, DDG Booksellers in Farmington, Left Bank Books in Belfast, the Book Tenders in York, and Print in Portland. Now, if you have a question during our conversation tonight, please send it over to us at fun@mainepublic.org, and I'll try to work it into the discussion. With that, let's get started. Amanda, welcome back to the Maine Public Book Club.
Thank you for having me again. It's
Oh,
exciting to be here.
it's great to see you again, and with a much different piece of work, I might add, which I found very engaging, and I think this is the first time I've done one that was an anthology of short stories. I think I counted there are 17 different ones in there.
Yeah.
Some short, some long, some oh, I just don't know where to begin here. But before we start on the book, I thought it might be helpful for our audience, those who might not have joined us last fall, to just tell us a little about yourself. You live in Nova Scotia. You're a college writing teacher. Just fill in the blanks a little bit there for us if you
Yes.
could.
No problem. Yeah, so I live in the Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia. Come on up for a visit. It's a beautiful place. And I do teach at Acadia University, and I'm associate professor of English and creative writing. I teach mostly Indigenous literature and creative writing courses. And I'm from this area, and a member of Glooscap First Nation. And yeah, I love to write, and I love to be here in my home, and my family has a very, very close relationship with Maine. I have family in Maine and New Hampshire, so yeah, it's very
Mm.
exciting to be.
We're neighbors, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. My dad, I have to tell you a little story. My dad will drive up to Maine, just get lottery tickets, and come home the same day. So,
Well, I hope he's won once in a while to make it worth it, right?
oh, I have
Uh,
to check his tickets when I come down for events, and so far
Oh, okay. I
four
see.
dollars
And then you
American.
decide whether or not you're going to go back or not, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Tell me, as we kick off this discussion of this book, I know we talked a little bit about it last September. In fact, it was just coming out then. Uh, Although, as you point out in your acknowledgments, you wrote these stories before the Berry Pickers. So this is something that has been rattling around there for a while. How did this book become a book? At what point did you decide I'm going to compile all this and put it into this kind of anthology?
I don't think I made a conscious decision. I think some other people were involved in that decision.
Oh, okay.
Um, But when I was here in Canada for the Writers' Trust of Canada in 2021, I was chosen by Katarina Vermette. She was my mentor and I was the mentee for the Rising Stars program. And part of that is that an established writer helps you work on something you're working on. And I already had a lot of mentors with the Berry Pickers, so I really wanted someone to help me with these short stories that I had written a long time ago and kind of just put away. So she said, "Yeah, I'll help you with those." So we just started going over them and I started reviewing them with her, and she started helping me get them into shape. And then my publisher here in Canada, HarperCollins, was like, "Okay, we want the short stories too." And I was like, "Oh, okay." In my head, they never really meant to be published in my, because I call them in my acknowledgments my training wheels,
Right.
because they're kind of like how I practiced to be a writer. I just a moment in time would come up that would inspire me, and I would write a story to see if I could write about that. So I wasn't really sure that they would ever be published, but after working on them with Kate and having my publisher see them, they said, Let's take the short stories." So I said, "Oh, okay, let's do this."
Mm. People have asked me if there's a common a through line through the whole book, and the one I can that's obvious is it's a cultural through line. In one way or another, all these stories touch on parts, indigenous characters, parts of indigenous culture, and
Mhm.
some of them strike me as real, what I'd call really old school storytelling.
Oh, well.
The kind of, dare I say, the campfire kind of stuff, the kind of stories that are passed down from generation to generation. Um, it's, you mentioned in your at the end of the book that some of these came to you from other people, and you may have done worked your magic on them, but they originated elsewhere. How important is it to you to preserve that tradition?
Again, it's another thing I don't think I intended to do. But like for example, the story The Birthing Tree in the novel, my
Mhm.
grandmother, when she was living with dementia and I was with her for the weekend, I have a very large family, so all of us took turns staying with her. And she was just looking at the window and she turned to me while I was reading a book on the couch and she said, "You know that tree down by the water?" I was like, "I do, Nan." She's like, "That's where the Mi'kmaq women used to give birth."
Huh.
And she was gone again, right? And I never got like the any anything more. But that stuck in my head for so many years. I mean, I wrote that story probably when I was like 38, and that was when I was 19, 18, 19 when she said that. So those just things just stuck in my head, and years later when I was writing, I was like, that deserves a story. So I don't know if I intentionally did it or if it's just something in the back of my brain just brought those
Hmm.
things forward when I was trying to find some inspiration.
Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. I want to focus on several of these as we chat
Yeah.
tonight, because there are certain aspects of each one that I found fascinating. But the first one is comes early in the book, and that's the birds and the terrorists.
Yeah.
Uh, and this story covers a lot of ground from it's a young childless mother unable to grieve to an extended protest on the site of a sprawling pipeline project, and along the way there are all these profound moments, not the least of which occurs when the narrator, under the watchful eye of her grandfather, finally comes face to face with the grief over a lost child. Tell us about that story, how that came to be. I wondered if it was one of the longer selections in the book,
Mhm.
and I found myself wondering if it could be the germ for a novel unto itself.
Not yet, I will say.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it won't be.
Yeah.
I actually wrote that when I was watching the news about Standing Rock. And I was just watching that. And there was a young Mi'kmaq woman whose name is escaping me right now, who felt compelled to go down there and felt compelled to be with her cousins in indigenous communities. It's like everything. And she just went. She got in her car and she went. All the other stuff is fiction. It's just that I was watching the news and then I saw her doing that and I was like, okay, I feel like there's a story there. And I just sat down and I wrote it. So again, it was inspired by something that was real happening in the world, but I just put a fictional bend on it. And at this point in time, I have no intention of expanding it into a novel, but that doesn't mean that won't happen because you never know where the creative brain goes.
Sure, sure. It's funny. I had a colleague at the time who did the same thing. He went there to that same protest right out of the blue, and
Yeah.
stayed there for several weeks. It was funny that seemed to attract a lot of people. There was one exchange in that when the narrator is talking to, I can't, is it Mima? The
Mala?
what was it?
Mala?
Mala, yeah. And they're talking about what's happening because you've got all the protesters down here and all the vehicles and everything on the other side of the line. And she says it's all PR. That they could go and they could do their pipeline work anywhere else right now. They're only here because we're here, and they're trying to make a show of this confrontation.
Yeah.
That struck me as a very insightful comment on I guess, the theater of protest, if you will, on both sides.
On
You know
both
that
sides, yeah.
you can't have a protest without an adversary. How closely did you follow that protest? I mean, were you
I don't
following
think
it
I
on a
followed
daily
that.
basis, or
I think most of Indigenous people followed that protest. Like on Facebook, we could check in even though we weren't there. So we would do that on purpose. Like I'd check in at Standing Rock just to make sure that people knew that we were paying attention. But I don't think I intentionally did that. I think that was one of those accidents of happy fate. I don't know.
yeah?
Happy accidents, yeah.
And the broken leg, just I don't know. That just I cringed but kept reading. Having broken a leg, it was like, oh no, don't go back up to that line. What are you? But it took a lot of courage, but she did.
He's a
Uh,
warrior.
yes, well, I want to move to one of the smaller ones, one of the smaller stories too, Ashes, which is really no more than three full pages long. Yet it's spellbinding in its depth. You credit Jesse Hemphill
I do.
for as you put it, putting that story in my mind.
Mhm.
Uh, how did that happen?
So Jesse and I were colleagues and friends in my previous career, working in Indigenous community development and financial administration and all that fun stuff. And we used to do conferences together. So she still works in BC. She owns her own consulting company in British Columbia. And one day she told a story about her community way back when. And the story was that the Indian agents came over and said, "We have a better opportunity for you to live on the mainland so that you don't have to live on this island and you have better opportunity for schools and services." So I said, "Okay, we'll go over and see what you have to offer." And while they were over there, the Indian agents went back and burnt their village to the ground, so they had nothing to go back to. And what they had been promised was absolutely nothing. They were just moved from a happy village where they could fend for themselves to poverty. And it just struck me. So I wrote that story, but then I accidentally met Jesse at a meeting in Vancouver, an Assembly First Nations meeting, and I gave it to her, and we sat down and had some hugs, had a glass of wine. I said, "Is it okay if I publish this? If I ask if it can be published?" Because at the time I didn't know if anybody would publish it. And she read it, she cried, and I cried, and she's like, "Yes, I would be so honored." So, yeah, I was gifted a lot of these stories, to be honest. There's a nugget of truth to a lot of them, and that were gifts to me from people smarter and wiser and braver than me, and I just turned them into something creative.
That the story has a shocking ending, as
That's
short
not
as it is.
that's fiction. That's fiction. It's just the story
Yeah.
was based on the premise of the village being burnt down, but the ending was, yeah, my ending.
Did you know as you started writing it that it was going to end that way, or you must have because it's not that long a story.
Yeah, it's a very
But
it's a very short story.
even for a story that short, I didn't see it coming
Oh,
until the end, and she goes over the edge of the boat, and I had to put the book down for a couple of minutes at that point, thinking, oh my God, it was on the one hand it was a horrible ending, on the other hand it was an inevitable ending.
inevitable is what I say because she didn't want to be the one to tell everybody that everything was gone. She didn't want to be the one to say we don't have a home to come back to, and they had put that burden on her. So
Right, she
she
was
just
the
felt that
last one out.
yeah, she just felt this was a better way than being the bearer of bad news. Yeah.
Uh, would you like to read one other one for us? This was The Crow,
Yes, yes, the story.
which is another short one, but equally powerful. And as I was reading it, I thought, oh, this would be wonderful to hear coming from your lips.
I've actually, when I do these things, people ask me to read this one, which I find very interesting. But this is a story that is, again, was gifted to me by my auntie. So my auntie told this story once, and I heard it. So then I asked, said, can I retell this in my own voice? And of course, she was like, yes, because it's an oral story, right? We all retell it in our own voice. But I did feel the need to get permission from her. And now every time someone asks me to read it, I send her a text. I get to read it again, and she's so pleased with it. So I will read. It's called The Story of the Crow, a retelling. Did you know that the crow was once white, whiter than fresh snow at noon under winter sun, whiter than the soft clouds that pass over the tops of trees in summer, whiter than the foam that forms where water meets land? Did you also know that the crow had a beautiful voice? The song of the crow was known the world over. You could always know the song of the crow because its beauty was unmatched, even to those unfamiliar with the ways of birds. Hearing the sound of a crow meant good fortune was coming your way. Such was the beauty and the power of the crow's song. And of course, the crow was the smartest of the birds. And not only the birds, but the smartest of all the animals. Every animal sought her advice, from where to place their nests to how much food to store for winter, to how to fall in love. The crow would watch over all the animals, those who walked, swam, flew, and slithered. She would fly silently among the branches of a large maple and giant oak, skimming past the needled firs and pines, singing her song, and they would call back to her, and she would be happy. She would pluck a drowning hummingbird out of a pond or rescue a baby robin redbreast who'd fallen from its nest. Once, it is told among the forest creatures, she saved Muin, the bear, the largest and most powerful of animals, when she got caught up in a dense web of brambles and was unable to free herself. But the crow would never tell these stories, such was her humble nature. She would sit high atop the trees telling the news of the forest, and everyone would stop and listen. But not once did she speak of her own remarkableness. Then one day a rumble of thunder and a crack of lightning echoed through the forest. A very small squirrel, his head previously buried in a collection of acorns, organizing them for winter, shot his head into the air, sniffing. He'd heard thunder before and seen the wonders of lightning flash across the sky, but this was different. He sniffed and sniffed, catching the faint trace of smoke on the air. He waited, his ears perked until he heard the crackle of flame on tree, and then he broke into a run. The wise crow would know what to do. The crow, sitting on a branch, her eyes heavy with afternoon sleepiness, saw the squirrel racing toward her, darting through the trees, leaping over roots and stones, chirping frantically. It's a fire, wise crow. A fire is coming. The crow lifted her beak into the air, still and quiet, detecting the smell of smoke. Without a word to the frightened squirrel, the crow began to sing, loudly and with urgency. She opened her beautiful white wings and took flight, singing a song of warning to the animals, her beautiful voice echoing off the trees and waking those who slept, stopping those who worked. Every animal listened to her song, a song of warning, and followed her through the forest, catching sight of her white body darting in and out of the trees. The crow, being the wisest of the animals in all the forest, led the others to the river and to the other side where a meadow sat. The smaller animals, the squirrels and the rabbits, the martens and the snakes, scampered or slithered across fallen logs. The larger animals, the coyotes and the bears, swam across the quiet waters. From the safety of the riverbank, the animals watched as the smoke billowed from the trees and flames licked the sky. They watched as over and over again the crow went into the forest deeper and deeper, warning the animals and guiding them to safety. And never did she stop singing her warning until the smoke got into her throat and her voice began to change. Each time she emerged from the smoke, her voice was different. The beautiful voice of the crow became rough until it was nothing but a caw. And each time she emerged, the flames staining her beautiful white feathers, she grew darker from the smoke and the soot. But when the fire reached the river and had nowhere else to go, the crow was happy. She emerged from the forest one last time, her voice broken and her body black. To this day, the crow is still the wisest of the animals, her feathers black like midnight with no moon, and her voice a caw because she was brave.
I will never look at a crow the same again.
I
And
am a
the
huge
next
fan
time they're
of
outside my window in the morning cawing, I'm going to cut them some slack.
Good. I'm going to apologize because I have a very needy dog who's currently trying to get my attention. So if she
Oh,
pops.
it's okay. Well, it's because you're talking about the crows. He's jealous. I'm going to move to, we have a few questions that have come in from our audience, and I'm going to read one of them to you right now because it kind of goes to that selection. This person says, as a reader, when I've encountered legends and origin stories in indigenous culture, I find that they are always so detailed and not rushed. What is the importance to you of writing and retelling the origins like that of the brave crow? How do you embrace your own creativity when it comes to writing these stories? And what parts do you feel you feel must be preserved exactly as you heard them?
That is a loaded question.
Mm.
Wow. Um, I don't know. Some of that retelling is stuff I made up. But the main point of it was with the story from my auntie, and I wanted to make sure that the intent and the lesson was there, and then me adding my own voice, my own way of writing, my own way of storytelling to it. And it is an oral story by nature, so it's going to change.
Mhm.
So I often speak to my students of this. When someone writes down an oral story like this one, that is not the end of that story. That story will evolve when another person tells it, and it will evolve again when another person tells it. So this is my evolution of that story. I think I got it right. My auntie likes the story, so that is where I get my validation from because she enjoys it and she thought it was well told. So I think it's just when you're retelling a story from an oral perspective, it's just important to get the intent and the lesson and the moral of the story right, and then you can. I have a friend who's an oral storyteller. Her name is Shalin Jowdry. She's a Mi'kmaq oral storyteller. She's like, as long as the skeleton of the story is there, you can add you can add the flesh onto it.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm just curious. Do you know how your aunt heard it, or who passed it on to her?
I didn't ask. I never asked. That's which is funny. I should probably ask that question, but I
Interesting to
just heard her.
see how far back you can trace it.
Yeah, I
Uh,
just heard her
yeah,
tell it once. I'm like, oh, that's a beautiful story. And then when I was writing short stories, just one day I was like, I wonder if I could tell this in my own voice. So I tried, and
yeah,
uh,
yeah. Uh, I I mentioned this with the tiny bird and the terrorist, but the same theme struck me in the Le Grand Dérangement, whatever, I mean, if it's a French title. Uh,
yeah.
uh, and that is, have you ever been, again, tempted to pick up where the story leaves off? In this story, little Helene is rescued from the raid on her French settlement by the raid by the English, and the story ends with her about to embark to winter camp with the narrator and his family, who have
Mhm.
rescued her basically
Yeah.
from this horrific raid. Uh, and as I finish that story, and she ends by saying merci, as she agrees to go with them, uh, it struck me as more of a beginning than an end.
Again, no intention of, but you just never know what happens. So I live in the land of Acadie, right? I live 10 minutes from Grand Pré, which is the home of the Acadian people, where the expulsion in 1755 happened. So that's what
Wow.
that's based on. That's the expulsion. That is the English, because the French refused to pledge allegiance to the English. They were sent off, and they ended up some of them back in France, some of them on the South Shore of Nova Scotia, many in Louisiana, actually. So they were the grand arrangement, the grand disappearance kind of thing. And I just thought, well, because the French and the Mi'kmaq have always had a very close relationship. So I was like, there's going to be a story there, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
then I was
yeah.
like, okay. And at the time, there was a large Maui-Omi, which is a Mi'kmaq word for powwow. There was a large Maui-Omi here happening at Grand Pré to celebrate 400 years of that relationship between the French and the Mi'kmaq. So
Hmm.
again, I was like, oh, there's this beautiful celebration. I wonder if there's a story there. And there you go.
Hmm.
Story.
Well, I hope things worked out. I mean, we knew she was all set for the winter, but who knows? Who knows what comes after that?
No,
Uh,
sorry. Maybe
well, that's
someday.
okay. That's all right. Uh, you mentioned earlier that the tree, the birthing tree that I think it was your aunt
My
mentioned,
grandma.
or I'm sorry,
My grandmother. It was
your grandmother. Okay. And we hear this term sacred ground bandied about
mhm.
all the time. I mean, I grew up near Fenway Park, and Fenway Park was Fenway, it was sacred ground, and
Right,
you know,
yeah.
churches are sacred ground. Yet, in reading the birthing tree, I found myself marveling at what truly, truly was sacred ground. The place at the base of a tree where generations of women have given birth, and it left me wondering because I live in a rural area. There are woods around, the house, and we go camping a lot. Sometimes even up in Nova Scotia, and I thought, my goodness, you can walk through the woods today and have no idea what you're
Mhm.
walking past.
No, you don't.
You- and you very well might be. touching sacred ground. There's a on the river down by my house is a place called Indian Cellar where uh, it was caves. It's now flooded. It's underwater because they dammed the river. But in before the dam was there, there were caves in the steep bank where they were caches for food and things like that. Uh, did how, as an indigenous person, do you are you find yourself aware of that when you're out in nature that the many feet that have trod these places before you did?
Yes, and I actually do a guest lecture for the last 2 years at Acadia for an environmental studies class, talking about the fact that you people call these woods unexplored, or they call this. Sorry, my dog again is being a little brat. They call like people have these woods are uninhabited. I was like, are they? Have they been? I'm pretty sure the generations of Mi'kmaq people have walked these woods and have been in these woods. And Mi'kmaq people and most indigenous people think that all land is sacred, but especially a land where birth happens, right? Where new generations are birthed into the world, where the water and the blood of women has been soaked into the earth and soaked into the roots of that tree. It's just such a powerful idea that my grandmother left me with that I
Mm.
had to make it into something. Yeah.
Yeah, that one moment where the mother giving birth is she's actually gripping the roots on
Yes,
the
yes.
side of her, and it's like the tree is nestling her. It was just the connection between human and nature there was so powerful.
Indistinguishable, indistinguishable.
Yeah, it really is. Uh, as we know, there are parts that you even have a caution at the beginning of this book that parts of it are difficult, and
Yes.
uh, and I want to touch on a few of those because equally powerful, yet at times uh, disturbing. There were times. Well, let's talk about 3 billion heartbeats,
Yeah.
for example. Did you ever read The Lovely Bones by
I
Alice
have read The
Sebold?
Lovely Bones. I did long ago. Yeah.
This reminded me of that because you don't realize until the end of this story that this person is deceased and she's literally speaking to us from the grave. And
Yes.
that brought me back to Susie, I think her name was, the
Yeah, yeah. I
girl
never
in The Lovely Bones who was looking down from heaven as all this stuff happened after her death.
and I love that book and I didn't even make that connection for that.
It's the
But
first thing I thought of. I thought, wow, that's just like Susie, but not really like very different in a lot of other ways. But this book, it made me wonder how many people out there, people go missing all the time.
Mhm.
And occasionally you'll pick up the paper and you'll say, oh, this is the 25th, 30th, 35th anniversary, or even longer anniversary of when this person disappeared and long presumed dead. And yet, especially for survivors, still out there somewhere. And I just can't think of a lonelier way to leave the world than to
Yeah.
be left the way this young woman was. Where did that story come from?
That is, you're not even gonna believe me when I tell you this because it's the weirdest idea. But the inspiration for that story came from a really old physics textbook that I bought at a library sale for $2. I have this weird fascination with physics, even though I don't understand a lot of it. And I was reading through it, and one of the questions was like, if you live to be 80, how many beats will your heart beat?
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
answer was a billion. So then I was like, but what if you die at like 20? Do you just exist in this dark space until it would have hit like 80 or 90 or some arbitrary thing? Or does your existence just stop when the last beats up? So I literally went round and round in my head with this thought. And I was like, I bet you there's a story there. And then of course, I watched there's a whole bunch of documentaries on the Highway of Tears. I don't know if you know, up here. How would you say, in British Columbia, a lot of Indigenous women go missing and have been found along this highway in British Columbia. And then I started thinking about that, and then I started thinking about these young women and their lives are cut short, and that's where that story came from. So it was a
Well,
combination of a bunch of different things coming together at once to inspire that story. And that story was the hardest to write. It was the reason why I put that trigger warning at the front because I was like, oh, I don't know if this is too harsh, but it's also the experience of a lot of Indigenous families.
Yeah, yeah, and terrifying at the end. I mean, because in this case, once they once the guy throws her in the car and they start heading out
Mhm.
into the hinterlands, you pretty much know what's going to happen. And it's like, yeah, I can see where that would have been very difficult to write.
It was difficult to write, but also in the end, she becomes one with the land as her mother always wanted her to. So it's still a devastating story, but I try to find a silver lining, sort of. If there can be
Yeah.
one, there obviously can't be, but at least she's at peace, I guess.
I was just going to say she finds peace. Yeah, yeah. Uh, a couple of the other stories, I got to tell you, Amanda, I was just plain angry. Not at you, but but at the characters. I mean, the two that stick out were just another dead Indian,
Right. Yeah.
where just the utter indifference with which this man's death is met, despite despite what the authorities claim, obviously not a drowning, something
Yeah.
happened, and nobody
That's
gives a hoot,
that story
except
is
for the nephew who's trying to find out what happened, and the other one was In the Name of God, where uh, all I wanted to see was a lightning bolt come out of nowhere and hit Father Jacob. Just be done with him, because having been raised a Catholic, I never knew a Father Jacob, but I know the I don't know the ethos, if you will, that some of these that a lot of us witnessed, especially back in mid-century, that time
right.
with the Catholic Church. So uh, with these two stories, there's this air of futility to
Mm.
them, in that the nephew knows as he's walking back to his mother, that wondering what he's going to tell her. There's nothing he can do about this. I think it's Jake, his buddy, the cop, is just
Yeah.
forget it. There's nothing we can do. And the same with the school, where this cycle just keeps repeating itself over and over again. These kids are going into this cupboard for days on end. Um,
Yeah.
Were you tempted, because you mentioned with 3 billion heartbeats, that there is a little bit of a not optimistic note, but there's peace at the end because she's finally found some refuge in the earth. Were you tempted at all to try to put I don't know, a hopeful spin on these stories, or was it hard just to put it out there and leave it the way it is?
Sometimes I do. I'm like, there has to be hope, there has to be joy, there has to be resilience. And sometimes I'm like, that's not how the world works, especially for Indigenous women on Turtle Island, right? There's a lot that doesn't wrap up nice and neat. So I think, and the story, Another Dead Indian, that's based on a true story. That's my great uncle, my grandma's brother.
Oh my
So
goodness.
yeah, it's fictionalized, obviously, but he was found drowned with fishing twine around his arms, his feet, and his wrists. But it was an accidental drowning, which I find very strange back in like the 40s. So it was like, and I've heard that story from my family for many years. So I was like, I'm going to fictionalize that because I wonder how my grandma felt when her only brother passed away, um, under those circumstances. So that's how I wrote that one. So yeah, it was hard, but I didn't want it to be a happy ending. I didn't want there to be a happy ending because I don't think my grandma got a happy ending in that one. She lost her
Right.
brother.
And
Yeah.
what about the schools? Because we hear a lot about these
Mm.
schools in many locations
Yeah.
where indigenous children were herded into them, and in this case, as in many others, it was the parents were thinking, well, the kids, first and foremost, the kids have to eat, and
Yes.
and they're going to feed them,
Mhm.
and they try, I guess, not to look back or think about what comes with that. Um, but this is still, uh, I I'm sure, an echo that resounds constantly throughout indigenous communities. Am I right?
Yes, of course. Like, I don't know of anyone personally. I've heard stories through the moccasin grapevine about people who had no choice. They knew that their
Mm,
children would be fed, because they were so impoverished, which was a result of colonialism itself, right? They were impoverished by the country they lived in. And they said, I just need my children to eat. Can you imagine
mm.
that being your decision? Like I just feel like so devastated by that. That one is not based on anything real. That is just from my imagination. But it was based on though Isabel Knockwood here in Nova Scotia. She wrote a book called Out of the Depths about the Shubenacadie Residential School here in Nova Scotia. And I think I was a little bit inspired by her true life telling of stories from the Shuby School to write that story about that. So again, the inspiration is so strange. It just would happen to be like a momentary thing that I hear, a dream I had. There's one called The Virgin and the Bear. The very first paragraph was a dream I had when I was like 20
Mhm.
years old. I just remembered it and I made it into a story. So you just never know where these little bits come from.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to go to another audience question here. I've got another one. The person asks, in stories like that of the young adult who leaves her home despite her mother's wishes, only to succumb to the forces of power and control and manipulative drug peddlers, how much of the end of the story did you plan while you were writing it? In other words, do you have that whole picture in mind, or do you let the story evolve?
No, I knew because it starts and ends at the same place, right?
Right. Mhm.
Starts and ends with her talking from the grave. So I always knew that's how it was going to go. I just had to fill in the middle. What
Yeah.
happened to her
Okay.
later there?
How does she
Um,
get into this mess?
how does she get into this mess? And then I
Yeah.
would just think of all the stories I've heard from like Vancouver and the downtown east side. I don't know if you guys know about Vancouver, the downtown east side, but it's basically our Skid Row from LA. It's our version of it here in Canada. So and I've been there, I've seen it, and I'm just like, okay, I was thinking about that, and that's how that came about.
Hmm. Yeah. Uh, Now you mentioned in your acknowledgments you called these the training wheels for the berry pickers, and I'm
Mhm.
curious. Now that you're up and riding that bike, obviously, you know you've got
Yeah.
a best-selling novel under your belt. Uh, as you wrote these stories, I'm just wondering, from an evolutionary standpoint, what you learned about yourself as an author, as a as a writer, because it's one thing to sit down and say, I'm going to write the novel. And,
Right.
that's
Yeah.
something that you obviously have your audience in mind the whole time. Yet, with some of these stories, as you mentioned earlier, it was more just something you were doing for yourself.
Yeah.
Uh, did you, what do you learn from that if you're writing something that perhaps no one will ever see?
Yeah, I think I learned to be a better version of myself through these. I'll explain why. I've always had a little bit of I always struggle with my mixed identity, right? I'm what's called white passing. I was raised predominantly by my mother off reserve, although my dad has always been a loving part of my family. And I didn't take part in Mawiomis and ceremonies, so I always felt like, who am I? Where do I belong? And maybe I'm not good enough. I'm not indigenous enough to call myself Mi'kmaq. This was always a thing swirling around in my head. Nobody put it there. It's just all me, the way I was thinking about the world. And then I started writing these short stories. So the first one was Begabook. That's why it's the first story there, because it's the first story I wrote from an Indigenous perspective and an Indigenous character. It was the first story I was proud of. It was my first publication. And then I was like, oh, maybe I can write these stories. And then I talked to a few elders, and one of my friend, who I call an elder in training, even though he's a little bit younger than me, but he's a cultural person. He's a pipe carrier, sun dancer, all the fun stuff that he does. And I said, read these. Am I allowed to tell these? And they didn't give me permission, but they're like, this is who you are. This is how you are Mi'kmaq. You don't have to go dance to be Mi'kmaq. You are contributing, telling our story to the world. And so I became like a better version of myself and a more confident version of an Indigenous woman through these stories. And I
Hmm.
was just writing them that way. And then when they're like, we're going to publish them, I was like, oh my God, I feel like my soul is being bared to the world, which is like
It's
so.
almost like someone reading your diary or something.
Yes, and one of these
What,
stories is actually an experience that I had myself, and I wrote it as a way to redeem myself. So I was just like, oh my goodness, they're going out into the world. Here we go.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, we talk a lot about storytelling, and that's the essence of this book. Uh, some of them traditional, some of them that are new, that came
Yeah,
straight from your heart and your head. Uh, I'm wondering, we're in this crazy age of TikTok and Instagram, and everybody's got a GoPro, and everybody's a documentarian. And I mean, we're just getting bombarded with what some people, I suppose, would call their story.
Right.
Uh, but I'm wondering how you feel about the future of indigenous storytelling in particular, but storytelling in general, uh, in the face of these. I don't know. I find they can be very, technological distractions.
Right. Yes. Well, I teach and I teach creative writing, and we have these conversations on things like AI in creative writing. And what I always say is that you can write a story with AI, but people will know because there's no heart in it, there's no soul. A computer cannot elicit empathy and joy, and they can write the words, but it's just gonna miss something, I feel. I haven't tried to write a story on AI. I generally try to avoid it if I can. Although now when you Google anything, it's the first thing that comes up.
Right,
Which
right.
and I'm like, how do I get rid of that? But yeah, it is a distraction. Some people I know are working with it. I think the creative brain needs to be the creative brain. It comes from somewhere. I don't know where, but allow it to flourish and allow it to tell the stories it's meant to tell and don't allow technology to come between that. Some people may disagree with me. I don't know. But it is a little bit complicated, especially I looked up on that The Atlantic post that website where AI gets all of its stuff, and they have taken both my books.
Oh,
And
so
I was like,
yeah, it must be a little disconcerting to what are they
it
going to do
is.
with them?
I was
I mean,
like, that
what's
is.
what's going to happen to that stuff?
Yeah,
Uh,
I was like, you can't. It's just such a complicated thing to think about, and so
yeah.
upsetting that they're just using it. And then then I was curious, so I went on and I typed in my book on AI, and they got a lot of the facts wrong. And I was just like, there's no character named that in that book. Like, I'm like, what is going on with this? So.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it is a distraction, but I think real creatives, real people who want to write real stories, who want to tell real stories, are not going to get sidetracked by that. They're going to tell it from their heart, and they're going to do it with purpose and intention.
Hmm. You mentioned, I think it was the bear. Uh, Help me
The
here.
Virgin and the Bear.
Say it again.
The Virgin and the Bear?
Virgin the bear. That's right. Came from a dream.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so try doing that AI. You try
Yeah,
try
exactly,
having a
right?
dream. But I'm going to go to one other audience question, which touches on that because it also goes to an essential element of these stories, and that is, when writing a short story, do you have the moral of the story in mind as you write it, or do you let the story develop and then the moral comes through naturally?
So I always had a hard time answering this question. And then I did an event at Briar Patch Books in Bangor with Morgan Talty. And he answered the question. He's like, I don't think writers always write for theme. They don't do that. They just write a story and then the theme naturally develops from it. And I was like, yes, I'm stealing that and I'm using it from now on because I just start writing. But I think that those things come out by virtue of who I am and my life experience. I couldn't have written The Berry Pickers or any of these stories when I was like 22. I couldn't have done that. I didn't have the life experience. I'm 48 now, 48 last Tuesday. So I have this life experience now that bleeds into the stories. So I don't write the theme. I don't intentionally sit down and say I'm going to write about missing and murdered Indigenous women. It just comes out. So, because prior to my writing life and prior to my professor life, I worked in Indigenous communities for 15 years, in health policy, in administration, in business, and I've sat in circles with residential school survivors. So I have all these experience that I wouldn't say leverage, that's a wrong word because it just sits the wrong way, but they have soaked into my psyche, I guess. These stories have soaked into my psyche and allow me to write this now. And like I said, and writing has been very therapeutic for me and it's allowed me to come to grips with who I am as a person.
Yeah, yeah. One theme that comes through a lot, though, is motherhood in these stories. That seems to be a something that you gravitate toward in a lot of
Which is
stories, the
strange
relationship
because
between
I
a
am not a
daughter
mother.
and a mother.
Yeah, which is a bit strange because I'm not a mother. I'm a fur mom to a Old English sheepdog and a little American short hair cat, but I am not a mother. I am a super auntie though, and I
Mhm.
do have two wonderful mothers, and I had lovely grandmothers. So I have a mom and a stepmom who are just amazing. My sister's amazing mom. My sister-in-law is amazing mom. So I think I'm just inspired by all the amazing women and
Mhm.
mothers that I see in my life. And I write towards that, I guess. And like I said, like my grandmothers were, they were just so good for me, and both my mothers are great, and my sisters, I don't know, I just write towards it.
Well, it's very powerful. What's next? Now that we have two books under our belt here, do you have, are you working on something now?
Yes.
Oh boy, she
That's all
said
you're gonna get from
cryptically.
me. That's all you're gonna get from me.
Well, as long as we can look forward to something else in the near future, I guess we'll settle for that.
I just actually printed off a brand new manuscript on Monday. I'm actually saying my feet are on it right now to hold my legs up because I'm in my office. That is, my house is under renovation, so everything is chaos. So I just put it under so I could beat my feet up. But I do have a new manuscript for a new novel, but it's still very, very raw and new. So we're working on it.
Well, we will look forward to that. We're just about out of time here. I want to thank you again, Amanda. This has been as delightful as our first meeting, and I look forward to whatever that manuscript is. Well, we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to talk to the folks in Maine, especially since, as my dad says, it's his second home. So
Good. Well, tell them to keep buying those lottery tickets.
I will. Hopefully, he wins more than $4 one day.
There you go. There you go. It'd be worth the trip. Thanks again. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us here today. A second shout out to Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, the Park Danforth and Coffee by Design for sponsoring tonight's event. Our next book club meeting will be on April 17th at 7 p.m. when we will be taking on The Buoyant Letters of Mimsy Bell by Laurel Dodge. That meeting, like all of them, will be live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. Amanda, thank you once again. And to everyone else, good night and happy spring.